All right, at this point we are going to prep the bike for this valve adjustment. To do so, the first two things we need to do are remove the fuel tank and the seat. The seat is removed with two 10mm bolts at the back, and then the fuel tank is a number of 8mm bolts on this one. There's a rubber strap that connects it to the subframe, and then you also, or what I like to do anyways, is remove the petcock. It's bolted to the frame. That's what I'm doing right there, and just makes the job a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. Alright, next step here is going to be removing the valve cover. Pretty simple on these bikes with the Uni-Cam, so all you're going to need to do is remove this spark plug wire, coil, whatever. You can unplug it for just sake of time. I left it plugged in and I just popped it out, and you can just set it off to the side out of the way. After that, you are going to use two 10mm, or remove the two 10mm. And from there you should be able to pull the breather tube off the back of the valve cover as seen here, and then you may have to give that valve cover a little bit of encouragement to get the rubber seal broken free, but should be able to break that rubber seal free and pull that valve cover off. Next step is going to be to set the motor to top dead center. To do so, you're going to remove this plug here. This is on the clutch side, which is on the right side of the bike if you're sitting down on the bike. It's a 10mm Allen, and just remove that. When you do so, there's going to be a mark on the sprocket that's inside that engine case, and you're going to line up that mark with on the sprocket with the mark on the outside of the engine case. There's a little triangle there. You're going to line those two up. Now to do so, I just use the Kickstarter to roll the motor over and get those two lined up. Once that's done, you're going to want to go to the other side of the bike and check that the cam sprocket is lined up. There's two lines on it. You're going to want them to be dead even with the head surface. So once you've lined that up, go to the other side of the bike, verify that everything's lined up and you are at top dead center. All right, next step is to grab a set of feeler gauges as seen here and actually check your valves, see what the clearance is, and verify if they need to be adjusted. This particular bike, all four valves were tight. To check those, you slide those feeler gauges. There's various numbers. I usually start somewhere on the tight end of whatever the spec may be, and just see if even the tight end fits. If they're really tight, then you won't even be able to get the smallest feeler gauge in there, and then you know something's really up. This one, they were all just on the very tightest end of the spec, which the spec on this is 0.09 millimeters to 0.15 millimeters for the intake, and 0.25 to 0.31 millimeters for the exhaust valves. This one was right on the tightest end of spec for all four valves, so I wound up adjusting them all with a size smaller shim. That got them all right to the looser end of the spec, which in my personal opinion is just easier on the bike. It will make it easier to start. It's going to be a longer time in between valve adjustments. Just from what I've done in the bikes that I've worked on, it's just a easier riding experience, and it's just easier to do so if you set them a little bit loose. Next step is going to be to remove the timing chain tensioner. It's those three 8mm bolts on the left side of the motor, just right in front of the carburetor there. Make sure that you do crack that middle one loose like I'm doing there before you take it off the bike. It's going to need to be removed before the timing chain tensioner can be reinstalled. So it's easier to crack it loose there instead of trying to do it when you're off the bike and you don't have anything to leverage it. So remove those three 8mm, and then we'll go from there. Also, just to point, you can disregard the zip tie that I have around the cam sprocket there. I put it there thinking maybe I could leave the cam and the sprocket attached to the timing chain. Sometimes that makes it easier for reinstallation if you don't have to fully remove the cam. On this particular model, I did have to fully remove the cam, so you can just disregard that. So once we get this out, we'll move on to the next step, which is going to be to remove that cam caps and then ultimately remove that cam so that we can access the top of the valves to change the shims. Quick little note before we get this thing pulled the rest of the way apart. For reinstallation, you're going to remove that middle 8mm, and insert a small flathead screwdriver into the timing chain tensioner. Wind that in, and when it's all the way wound in, it will lock itself in place, which is what you're going to need to do for reinstallation, just like that. Okay, next step is to remove the cam caps. There's 2 of them on this bike, and then we're going to end up fully removing that cam. To do so on this bike, there are 4 10mm bolts that are going to clamp that cam down to the head. Once you get them loose, everything on this head is machine fit. So, and they have dowel pins, those cam caps do. So they can be kind of tricky to get loose and get all the way out of there. One thing also to keep in mind is that there are these little half moon washers or keepers underneath the cam caps. Just be real careful when you're pulling this all apart that you don't drop one of those. And just keep an eye out, make sure, just be aware that they are there. Because, if you drop one of those down in the timing chain case down to the bottom, it's kind of a pain to get them back out without removing the stator and all that. So, something to be mindful of. We'll get this thing removed. Like I said, 4 10mm. Keep an eye out for those little keepers, and we'll go on from there. Once you have that cam removed, you're going to want to remove the buckets, which are those chrome looking deals right there, and then underneath those buckets on the intake side are the shims. Those are the shims right there. So you'll remove both of those, and then on the exhaust side, it's actually really easy on these Hondas. They don't use buckets for the exhaust because of that rocker arm setup they have. So you can just tilt the rocker arm back and magnet those shims right out. Then we'll get a measure on them and see where we're at. So as I'm removing all these parts, I like to lay them all out in the orientation that I remove them on a bench. So as you can see there, I have the exhaust valves shims as far away from the cam as possible, and then I have the intake valve shims as well as those cups all lined up so that I can keep track of everything. I don't mix anything up, and I know where everything goes when I'm putting it back together. Using a micrometer, I like to verify the thickness of the shims that came out, because although most of them have writing on them, if you can still read it, they may have worn down and they may not be accurate as when they were put in. So I use a micrometer, just double check, and then I will write my findings down. And from there, we can determine what size shim needs to go back in to give us the correct thickness. A lot of the times I'll use a valve shim calculator. You can look them up online. It's pretty easy. They do all the math for you. You just enter in your current valve clearance, your current shim size, and your desired valve clearance, and then it'll tell you what shim you need to put in. This bike was such an easy one that I just was able to see what size shims were in it, go down one size on all 4 because all of them were so close to being in spec. They were all just right on the tightest end. So going down one size on all 4 actually put all 4 of the valves right on the loose end of spec, but still in spec. So they're all good to go, just not as tight as they were before. All right, so now for the fun part, we are going to use our magnet to pull that timing chain back up. I would say if you don't have a magnet, then when you are removing the cam, make sure you put a big long screwdriver or zip tie that timing chain up to where it's not going to be a real pain for you to try and dig it back out of there. I just always keep a long flexible magnet on hand, mostly for doing these. So now that we have that chain pulled back up out of there, it's time for the fun part. We're going to be trying to get that cam set back in and also get our timing reset. So this can be a little bit of a tricky process. It does take patience. You are going to just try and get that chain on, see where your timing is, get it as close as you think it'll be. The way you have to put these back on, you kind of roll the cam sprocket into the timing chain, and a lot of the times you're going to be off one tooth or two teeth, or so take your time, check, double check, and just make sure that your timing is right before you seal this thing back up. Like I said, it's just something you want to spend some time on. Know it's going to be a little bit of a pain, and it's going to take some patience. I don't know why, but on this one, I was fighting it for quite a while. It took me a long time to get this thing reset, but it is reset. Timing's dead on, and everything's looking good. Once that timing is all set and you're confident in it, it's time to put those cam caps back on. Remembering to reinstall the dowel pins if for some reason they fall out, and then making sure that you do reinstall those half moon keepers. And when you're putting it all back together, just make sure everything's lining up. Don't force anything on. It should all set back in fairly easy, fairly straight, and everything should be pretty snug. Like I said, these cam caps are machine matched to the head, so it's a nice tight fit. I would like to mention too, torquing the cam caps properly is a fairly important task as well. They do have a very specific torque spec, and if that torque spec is not met or if it's overdone, you can cause some binding on the cam itself and prematurely wear out your cam and your head. The cam caps will wear out as well, so just make sure you torque to spec and in the proper sequence. Now that the timing is set, the cam caps are back on, everything's good to go. We're going to reinstall that timing chain tensioner. Once this timing chain tensioner is back in, it may very well release that little holder that we set as you tighten it down. If it doesn't, what I always do is just put that flathead back in and just verify that the timing chain tensioner has released. Usually you can hear it snap, hear it release, and then you'll physically see the chain get tighter. When that happens, I just one last time verify my timing, make sure that as the timing chain tensioner is released and tension is put on the timing chain, it doesn't roll the cam to where it indicates that your timing is off. You just want to make sure that at this point, this is going to be kind of your last chance. Just verify that your timing is set properly. So now, as you can see, the marks, the two little lines on either side of that cam sprocket are lined up evenly with the surface of the head, and the mark on the sprocket is lined up with the mark on the case, on the outer case on the other side. This is also a good opportunity, now that everything's been tightened and torqued down, to verify your valve clearance. Just make sure that all your math was right, all your measurements before were right, and just verify that everything is set and in spec how it should be. And now we are nearing the end. It's time to reinstall the valve cover. So we're just going to fit that back in place, make sure that the gasket doesn't get pushed off to one side or another as you're placing that back on. Everything's grooved, so it should line up fairly easy. Another thing to take note of is that part of that gasket does go around the tube for the spark plug. Make sure that gets pressed in properly and it doesn't get pinched or knocked off to one side. Should all go on pretty even. Reinstall previously removed 10mm Allen engine plug where we check top dead center. One thing I did forget to mention earlier was to make sure that you reinstall the two 10mm bolts that hold the valve cover in place, as well as reinstall the breather tube on the back of the valve cover and the ignition coil back into its place on top of the spark plug. Along with that, once that's all done, it's time to reinstall the fuel tank and the seat, and that'll be just about it. So again, it's on this one, I removed that fuel valve, so we're going to reinstall it on the frame, hook our fuel line back up, reinstall all previously removed hardware, and find out if this thing fires right up. All right, moment of truth. This thing is stone cold, so we'll see how quick she fires up. Well, there it is. We've got ourselves a runner. Thing fired up. First, second kick, so should be good to get back on the trail. I hope you like this video. We've got lots more coming. We work on some Banshee, CR500, KX500, KX250F we're doing some work on, all sorts of stuff. So if this is what you're into, please like, follow, subscribe, and we'll have lots more coming soon. All right, have a good one, guys.